Hey class, this video is going to look into biogeography and biodiversity concepts. And these concepts really sort of lie at the intersection of ecology and evolution and geography. And this sort of offers an interdisciplinary approach to explain why species occur where they do, maybe where species have occurred in the past, and how many of them are there in the present, and maybe how many of them were there in the past. And all of these ideas get us at an understanding of why species sort of occupy the various environments that they have and how their diversity has sort of unfolded over sort of large periods of evolutionary time. And the probably most fundamental way to try to understand this is looking at what we might call a deep history of life on Earth. And we know that Earth has been around for quite a while. We can sort of evaluate changes in life forms that have occurred, evolutionary changes, going back something like 4.5 billion years since planet Earth was first formed. And of course, there is no evidence of life existing this far back. In fact, there's very little evidence of much from that period of time because a lot of the fossil record or even the geological record from this time has probably been destroyed because this happened such a long time ago. But we do know that there's evidence to suggest that life might have come on the scene during this sort of so-called RNA world, which sort of predates our present understanding of how life does its business via that thing called the central dogma of biology. So organisms using DNA to make proteins, etc. And this ultimately leading to maybe the origins of organisms that could do photosynthesis, maybe some levels of diversification among these organisms, maybe some level of endosymbiosis, where different unicellular organisms had different interactions with each other to go on to become more complex forms. There's a lot of debate about that, but something or other must have unfolded during this so-called Precambrian time for life to have originated. And so we can think about all of this again in the context of geological time, which is basically broken into these eons, which are then broken into subsequent eras, which are broken into subsequent periods and subsequent epochs. And we have the time scale here, basically in millions of years ago, sort of describing how long ago these different things happened. So basically, we do know that probably eukaryotes came on the scene something like 1.6 million years ago. So that's quite a while after the origins of our planet. And that the earliest multicellular forms probably didn't come on the scene until maybe a million years after that. And so we start seeing things like trilobites showing up in the fossil record, some of the earliest photosynthetic algae or precursors to algae anyway, maybe photosynthetic bacteria showing up on the scene. And even more recently, we see the origins of non-vascular land plants. So photosynthetic life finally finding its way onto land sometime during the so-called Paleozoic era. And then finally, the actual origins of vascular land plants, like things such as ferns, maybe occurring somewhat later. Things like the origins of terrestrial invertebrates, so precursors to modern arthropods, for example, happening also in the Paleozoic. Maybe the origins of amniotic eggs. These are eggs that can survive outside of water, so eggs that can survive on land within mostly, we would say, terrestrial vertebrates, or maybe in some terrestrial invertebrates as well, depending on how you look at it. And then a little bit later, toward the end of the Paleozoic, we finally see in the fossil record the first evidence of flowering plants. And these flowering plants were probably a bit more primitive than flowering plants we know of today, but they certainly had a lot of the characteristics that modern flowering plants have, as well as us seeing the origins of vertebrates starting to occur again toward the end of the Paleozoic. And so this Paleozoic period represents kind of an interesting chunk of time in Earth's history, Earth's evolutionary history, going from very, very simple life to life becoming sort of complicated and life finding its way onto land. And the Paleozoic sort of transitions into another era we call the Mesozoic. And this transition is associated with an extinction event. That might not be super well understood, but if we look at the fossil record, we can see that a lot of organisms that appeared in the fossil record during the Paleozoic seem to disappear during the Mesozoic. And this is probably related with some type of an extinction event. And of course, the Mesozoic is sort of more famous for including the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods, which we know of as being a pretty important period of time for the diversification of vertebrates, reptiles, for example, things like dinosaurs, but also plants, not necessarily flowering plants, but a lot of gymnosperms, or things we would call pteridophytes, which are basically fern-like kinds of plants, really diversified quite a bit during the Mesozoic period, or the Mesozoic era, I should say. And there seems to be a full-blown radiation of life that has emerged between the time of the early Paleozoic, from this thing we call the Cambrian explosion, where life really seems to, I should say, multicellular life really seems to have diversified, into the Mesozoic, where life has now really become even more complicated, really leading to the formation of what we would imagine were all kinds of different complicated ecosystems all across the globe. So this is an interesting way that we understand some of Earth's evolutionary history. And of course, the Mesozoic famously sort of comes to an end when, as we best understand it, a meteor or a comet, some sort of rock from outer space hit Earth, and it did so in the Yucatan Peninsula down in what we currently call Mexico. And this had a tremendous impact on life. This caused tremendous amounts of extinctions. It was a huge mass extinction. Obviously, this is what led to the demise of dinosaurs and a lot of other associated taxa. But this also opened the door for a lot of different other types of organisms to diversify even more. For example, mammals hadn't really diversified a whole lot up until this point in time. And we kind of think that the extinction of dinosaurs opened up a lot of ecological niches that allowed mammals to start radiating into these different lineages in order to occupy these different niches. And so in the fossil record, we see that mammals diversify quite a bit as the Mesozoic comes to an end and the Cenozoic begins. And there's a whole lot of other complicated stuff going on that's sort of beyond the scope of our conversation. But basically, it's only in the last 200,000 years during the Quaternary that we see the origin of our own, the lineage giving rise to our own species, the hominids. And so this is kind of interesting that while we're here talking about all of this diversification and all of this history, we've really only, our ancestors really have only been around, our more recent ancestors have really only been around for a relatively short period of time in the grand scheme of the history of life on Earth. And so, anyway, this is just one way of thinking about where did life come from? How has it diversified? And how has that diversity changed to become what it presently is today? And of course, we have a pretty good understanding of what life is like today. It's more and more difficult to understand what life is like in the past, especially as we go deeper and deeper and deeper into the past. So these are sort of some of the goals of our thinking in terms of biogeography and how that relates to biodiversity. Now, all of this evolutionary change really is tightly related to rates of diversification. And evolutionary biologists are still trying to understand what kind of a model we can use to understand how different rates of diversification might happen and how these different rates of diversification might have unfolded over these long periods of geological time. And two sort of famously contrasting models are these things called phyletic gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. And basically, phyletic gradualism is this idea that evolution kind of happens slowly, and it's happening via these processes of anagenesis and cladogenesis. And this is kind of how Charles Darwin thought about evolution. But basically, if we think about these two hypothetical graphs here, which kind of are like frequency distributions changing over time, and those distributions representing some type of trait structure in lineages, and time over here. Under phyletic gradualism, we would say that, well, evolution's happened very gradually via anagenesis, so trait values are changing very gradually over time, and then suddenly there's an event of cladogenesis, which is diversification, and then this process of phyletic gradualism continues, where this one lineage starts to evolve in this direction, and this one lineage over here evolves in a different direction. And so this postulates that evolution has happened really quite slowly over time to lead to the current different forms of biodiversity that we see today. Punctuated equilibrium, on the other hand, is much different. Under this model, we see uh, similar variables being discussed, similar frequency distributions, so to speak, and maybe that the frequency of the traits are sort of shifting back and forth and shifting back and forth, and then all of a sudden we have an event of cladogenesis that is punctuated, that it's extreme. It's not just this gradual sort of change, it's a rapid, sudden change of traits in one lineage giving rise to quite contrastingly different traits in these two subsequent uh, descendant lineages. And so we see rapid diversification via this thing called cladogenesis, followed by something we would call stasis. That is to say, following this huge diversification event, then maybe after that, there's not a whole lot of evolutionary change. So these are just these two sort of contrasting models. The punctuated equilibrium model, by the way, was proposed during the 20th century by Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge. And so anyway, we might start asking questions about, well, which model is right? Well, probably both models are, and probably both models have operated at different periods of evolutionary time. There may have been occasions where certain lineages have evolved gradually, and there may have been other occasions where certain lineages evolve very rapidly. And this is all really related to how the environment is shaping their ability to evolve. And of course, that is very tightly related to the kinds of mutations that have emerged, how natural selection operates on those mutations, whether or not those populations are subject to genetic drift or how much they are subjected to genetic drift, etc. So all the causes of evolution are certainly going on behind the scenes here. What we're now trying to kind of think about, well, is how fast has this happened, and how does diversification really unfold under well, over really long periods of evolutionary time. And what all of these processes have led to, however we want to sort of understand them or sort of theorize how they could have unfolded, what we do know for a fact is how much biodiversity there is on the planet, or at least we have an estimate of how much biodiversity there is on the planet. As a matter of fact, nobody exactly knows how many species do exist today, and that happens for a handful. That's because of a handful of reasons. Number one, being the use of different species concepts. Number two being the fact that some species maybe haven't been discovered yet. And different biologists are trying to study biodiversity in all kinds of different ecosystems and all kinds of different parts of the world. And so it's kind of hard to come to a consensus about just how much biodiversity really does exist. But if we at least step back from looking at, well, how many species are there, we can start talking about, well, how do different taxonomic groups contribute to the distribution of biodiversity across the globe as best as we can understand? And as it turns out, we can look at this pie chart here, something close to 60% of the extant or currently living taxa, species, if you want to call them that, are insects. So we have beetles and flies and wasps, butterflies, moths, a whole bunch of other insects that are all sort of grouped together, lumped together, making up more than half of the total biodiversity of our planet. That's pretty incredible. And among this particular chunk of the pie, we see that 37% of insects are beetles. 22% of the total biodiversity of our planet is made up of beetles. This is pretty interesting. Why is it that beetles have been able to diversify so much more than any other taxonomic group? And more broadly speaking, why is it that insects have been able to diversify so much more than any other taxonomic group? And the answer is maybe not obvious, maybe not even totally understood or completely clear, but there is some evidence to suggest that insect lineages have done really well at diversifying within a huge multitude of different kinds of ecological niches that are available to them. They tend to be rather small organisms. They tend to be rather efficient organisms that can reproduce rapidly when given the opportunity. And a lot of them can fly, and flight enables dispersal to new habitats, potentially allowing diversification to occur via the process of speciation. So anyway, hard to say exactly what's going on there, but we do know for a fact that most of the biodiversity on our planet is represented by these insects. And then less so, we see that there's a pretty significant chunk of this pie piece made up by organisms that do photosynthesis. And it's not terribly surprising that that's the case because photosynthesis is a pretty important ecological process. It allows energy to be taken from the sun by photosynthetic organisms, mostly plants on land and more often algae in the water. But this energy becomes available to all of the other organisms that share the ecosystem with these photosynthetic life forms. And this is probably a pretty important basis for how ecosystems can become structured, and other organisms can survive based on that available energy. So this is kind of an interesting situation about how we understand biodiversity, but this is the way it is today, and it's an interesting fact. Let me talk a little bit about our understanding of biodiversity, where it sort of came from, how it's distributed, and then we can talk about this thing called biogeography. Well, what the heck is biogeography? Just another word? Well, quite specifically, biogeography is the study of the distribution of living things on Earth. So this map here shows Earth with its different continents, and we have these contrasting orange and blue colors. Basically, orange hypothetically represents the range of some species. This species occurs in these areas that are orange. So in this example, whatever species we're talking about has populations distributed in the sort of southeastern part of North America, Central America, South America, and also over here in Australia. But in the other parts of the world, this species doesn't occur. So that's one way that we can look at the distribution of a species. Where does it occur? Now, biogeographers basically break this subject down into two subsets. One is historical biogeography, and the other is ecological biogeography. And these two paradigms are really looking at the distribution of species from two very, very different perspectives. Historical biogeography is much more focused on understanding what the long-term changes in the evolution of species and in the environment have been as far back as we can possibly study them. Whereas ecological biogeography is much more focused on understanding what the short-term, more fine-scaled changes influencing the distribution of organisms might be. So historical biogeographers probably are spending a lot of time thinking about the fossil record and plate tectonics and how the Earth has changed over these tremendously long periods of time that we see here in the on a geological time scale. Whereas ecological biogeographers are probably more interested in thinking about ecological niches and how variation in ecological niches is leading to processes causing species to occur where they do. And when we're talking about where species occur, we're generally talking about where they occur in the present. And this sort of idea about biogeography first was sort of proposed or first sort of described by Alfred Russel Wallace, who was one of the earliest naturalists who had the chance to sort of travel the globe and start to make observations about the distribution of different species or different taxonomic groups. And he started to realize that there were very specific patterns in the distribution of different living things. And this led him to describe what are known as Wallace's biogeographic realms. And these realms basically delineate major areas that have different characteristic flora and fauna. And as it turns out, the differences in the distribution of this flora and fauna very much is based on Earth's history, in some ways, maybe more so than present conditions. So things kind of got distributed to where they occur now via very historical processes, and they either continue to occur where they can or evolve where they can via more ecological biogeographical processes. And so basically we can look at these different continents, probably familiar, and we can assign different designations to them, basically according to their relationship with latitude. And so we have the equator here, and we have the tropics, both north and south of the equator. And basically, in North America, we have the Nearctic biogeographic realm, whereas in Eurasia, we have the Palearctic geographic realm. In contrast, in South America, we have the Neotropical biogeographical realm. In Africa, the so-called Ethiopian biogeographic realm. In South Asia, the Oriental biogeographic realm. And then there's also the Australian biogeographic realm. And also these deserts. And Wallace might not have been too privy to this, but as we know better today, that the distribution of different biomes is very, very tightly related to latitude. And so the tropics occur around the equator and don't really occur that much further north than the Tropic of Cancer or that much further south than the Tropic of Capricorn. And so all of these different environments that occur in Central America, parts of South America, parts of Africa, parts of Asia, and maybe even parts of Australia and Indonesia, share a similar climate. And this similar climate kind of leads to the distribution of similar kinds of species that fill very similar kinds of ecological niches. Whereas when we get away from the tropics, we start to get into more subtropical environments, such as we see in southern parts of North America, southern Eurasia, likewise southern South Africa, southern South America, South Africa, and sort of South Australia. And also in these areas, we see deserts. And so as we start to get away from the tropics, there actually tends to be cooler conditions and less rainfall, whereas closer to the tropics, there are warmer conditions and more rainfall. And this is really affecting the distribution of flora and fauna and really influencing the way that different lineages are able to evolve in response to these different environments. And then at the extremes, of course, away from the equator, away from the tropics, we have more temperate regions, such as those we find in the Arctic or near the Arctic or in northern Eurasia. Less so in southern South America. There's a lot more landmass in the northern hemisphere than there is in the southern hemisphere. So we see biodiversity being distributed quite a bit more in the northern hemisphere compared to the southern hemisphere. But anyway, these are Wallace's biogeographic realms, and they do somewhat accurately reflect the fact that the flora and fauna that occurs around the equator is not terribly different from one location to the next, although there might be some succinct differences, say, between the neotropical and the Ethiopian, or the Nearctic and the Palearctic. But the diversification of lineages seems to be responding to these different patterns in the distribution of these geographic areas. We probably today have a better understanding than Wallace did about how taxa have been distributed around the globe historically. And we know about this from the fossil record. And so we can look at the fact that although we know today that the continents are distributed in this way across the globe, that wasn't always the case. And we have a lot better understanding of this via the science of plate tectonics. So geologists have started to figure out that the continents have been moving around via this crazy process called continental drift. And so the continents have not always been in their current positions, and they probably won't always be in the future either. But long, long ago, there's strong evidence to show that probably continents such as South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia were all pretty much tightly linked together into one sort of supercontinent. And this is seems to be obvious because of the distribution of different fossil taxa that occur across the areas where these different continents may have been joined. So, for example, there are fossils of Cyanognathes that occur in South America, and similar fossils of the same taxon that occur in a very similar part of Africa, where these two continents probably were joined at one time. We see something similar with Lystrosaurus, occurring from sort of southern Africa across to Madagascar, down through India, and into Antarctica. Likewise, we see something going on with mesosaurs, where there are fossil mesosaurs in South America, in the southern part of the continent, and also fossil mesosaurs in southern Africa, at the southern part of the continent. And so these relationships suggest where these continents might have been joined, how these species that are all now extinct may have been distributed at one point in time long, long ago, probably going back to Paleozoic times, or Mesozoic times, I should say. So going back to maybe this time period here, this geological era. And then there's this other thing called the Glossopterous flora. And the Glossopterous flora is a flora represented by these ferns that are now extinct. But these ferns must have been very, very abundant at one time because they show up in the fossil record all over the place. In fact, we see them in the same sort of parts of South America that were probably linked to Africa, Likewise, in the same parts of Africa that were probably linked to Madagascar, and the same parts of Madagascar that were probably linked to India, that were also linked to Antarctica, and probably also linked to Australia. So this glossopterous flora existed across this whole area at a different time when these continents were linked. And this suggests not only that they were all joined together into one continent, but that these species had distributions spread out across this whole area. And this provides some pretty interesting evidence to show, hey, A, the continents haven't always been where they are, and B, these different fossil lineages that once existed no longer do, but they once seemed to represent biodiversity that existed a long time. Now, biogeographic patterns actually are pretty helpful explaining evolutionary diversification. And a classic example we can look at with this are these things called ratites. Ratites are basically birds that can't fly. Well, that's kind of a strange concept, because we know that the ancestors of modern birds most likely did fly, but apparently some lineages dispersed into certain areas and subsequently lost the ability to fly. How did this happen? Well, as it turns out, it happened more than once on multiple occasions, probably via this thing we call convergent evolution. And so this is kind of what a potential ratite or a cartoon of what a ratite looks like. They had distribution across so-called Gondwana land. That's sort of a name for this area where all these continents once were joined together into a single continent. But then they dispersed. As these continents started to break apart, these ratites started to disperse to subsequent different continents, different land masses as they were available. And so we can look at this phylogeny that kind of shows how there was this dispersal pattern followed by diversification amongst independent lineages, each of which lost the ability to fly. And so probably at some point in time, we think that actually the ancestor of all these birds occurred in the northern hemisphere, but then they started to disperse into the southern hemisphere and began to diversify. This is probably happening sometime after that great mass extinction event at the KT boundary. And then these things started to spread around. And what we can kind of see from this phylogeny are all of the different types of ratites that we know either do exist today or have existed in the past. So the ones in gray are extinct. So elephant birds are extinct, tinamoos are extinct, but kiwis, emus, cassowaries, tinamoos, et cetera, these birds still do exist today. And they all sort of exist on different continents. And what's surprising from looking at this graph is that some of the close relatives that we know that do occur in different areas, and they lost flight independently. So, for example, let's take a look at things like moas that occur in New Zealand, share their closest ancestors with tinamoos, who are now extinct, who actually have a fossil record in South America. But there are also kiwis that are flightless in New Zealand, but they're kind of distantly related from moas. So this is an interesting example of how multiple lineages of these birds diversified, rather dispersed into different environments, subsequently then diversified, and then each subsequently lost flight, presumably because flight became disadvantageous in these different environments. There wasn't really a need to invest energy into being able to fly around. There was maybe a lack of competition, or resources simply just weren't limited. So anyway, this is just an example of how we can study both historical and present patterns in the biogeography of species and understand how evolutionary diversification may have unfolded. There are a couple ways that we think about biogeographical patterns, and that's typically via either the process of dispersal or the process of vicariance. And those terms might sound familiar. So the geographic distribution of really closely related taxonomic lineages could often be a consequence of their dispersal. And we see evidence of that with these plants in the genus Psychotria, which are not too distantly related to coffee, on the Hawaiian Islands. And basically, we sort of know that the Hawaiian Islands form this chain of older islands and subsequently younger and younger and younger islands. So, for example, the island of Kauai might have been formed 5 million years ago, whereas the modern big island of Hawaii was formed maybe less than 500,000 years ago. And we can look at a phylogeny of different species of Psychotria and get an idea of how there were probably different dispersal events from from older islands to younger islands. And so it seems like the ancestral species or the common ancestor of all modern Psychotria occurred on the island of Kauai. And that subsequently, as the island of Oahu was formed, that individuals or seeds of these individuals somehow or other dispersed to the island of Oahu from the island of Kauai. And we can see in this phylogeny how the different colors of the different branches represent the different islands where the different lineages of Psychotria dispersed. So we see the original ancestral lineages occurring on Kauai, and maybe one of those eventually has the opportunity to disperse and colonize Oahu. And then maybe we see this happening again here, whereas these other lineages here don't leave Kauai. So the orange is Kauai, the red is Oahu, the green is Maui, the blue is the big island of Hawaii. Anyway, we see it takes a while to get to the point where Psychotria has finally come to colonize Maui, and that's happened maybe here in this particular lineage. So there has been a dispersal event from Kauai to Oahu to Maui, and then even from Maui, we see another dispersal event to the big island of Hawaii. And so by virtue of different dispersal events happening from one island to the next, speciation has been able to occur. And so this lineage that originally only probably contained a single species that occurred on the island of Hawaii, diversified on Kauai, diversified on Kauai, and then subsequently went on to diversify on these other islands as they were formed. And so we see this process of dispersal being pretty important for not just the geographic distribution of species, but their evolutionary history, their diversification, really being facilitated by the occurrence of these novel environments. Vicariance, much like we talked about during the process of speciation, is also probably responsible for the geographic distribution of different taxa. And so instead of us having a single population wherein a small subset goes on to colonize new ground, now we have a situation where there's a single environment and populations somehow or other are broken into different pieces. And one classic example of this comes with plants in the cypress family in this genus Thuja. And basically, there's fossil evidence to show that Thuja occurred when these continents were all joined together into a supercontinent, basically composed of two subsets that we call Laurasia and Gondwana, overall known or collectively known as Gondwana land. But basically, the ancestral populations of these cypresses occurred all the way across this group of continents that were joined together into a supercontinent. And there really weren't a lot of species. But as these continents started to break up about 150 million years ago or so, as we can see on this phylogeny, look at the geological time scale here, they started to diversify. And they probably started to diversify because these different continents were drifting into very different latitudinal environments, experiencing very, very different climates, and probably experiencing very, very different selection pressures. And we can see that basically two very major subfamilies within this group came to diversify either in one area or the other. And so we see this is one major subfamily here. It became separated as one or two of these continents became isolated from the other continents that ultimately separated on their own. And so this is how the process of vicariance can lead to diversification, as opposed to how the process of dispersal can lead to diversification. So basically what we can see looking at the phylogenetic evidence is that when this particular group split, one subspecies seemed to have been became distributed in South America and Oceania. That's this subfamily here shown in red. And the other subfamily seemed to split and diversify instead in Eurasia, North America, and Central America. And so, again, this process of continent splitting took these different populations apart, these different species apart, I guess populations apart, and allowed them to diversify subsequently over pretty long periods of geological. And there may have been some subsequent dispersal events, as we see with the blue, which represents lineages of these cypresses that ended up in Africa. But by and large, it's these two processes of dispersal and vicariance that, again, are causing species to become distributed in different places and potentially diversified in those places. Now, sometimes certain factors like competition, or maybe limitations to dispersal, or maybe sort of isolation of a fundamental ecological niche, or even things like climate change, can lead species to occur in these things we call disjunct populations. And disjunct is just a fancy word for saying these populations are distributed away from one another. They don't have continuous distribution. Their distributions are patchy. And so one example of this comes from things like the canyon live oak here in southwestern North America. And so this is a map of the area, and the green sort of blobs represent areas where this species is known to occur. And we can see that by and large, this species has a pretty continuous distribution in much of central and northern California, and to a lesser extent, it does also in southern California. But as we start to get into southeastern California, northern Baja, and parts of Arizona, the distribution of the species is extremely patchy. Each of these little blobs here represent disjunct populations of the canyon live oak. And as it turns out, these particular species are relics of past widespread distribution. And so, probably something like 10 or 15,000 years ago, when the climate was a lot different in southwestern North America, there might have been much more continuous distribution of the species. But as the climate dried out following the end of the last ice age and also became warmer, these populations of canyon live oak could only really survive in certain spots where they had a fundamental ecological niche. And so we would call these disjuncts. And this is just one example of a disjunct species. There are many, many other species that have sort of bizarre distributions where you might find an occurrence of them over here, and then hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away, you find an occurrence of them here, but they don't occur anywhere in between or anywhere else beyond there. And so there's just these interesting questions about how does this happen? Well, again, it's because of these different factors that can really influence their ability to become established and continue to survive and reproduce. This is kind of how the situation played out with canyon live oak, really in the region we call the Mojave Desert today. Probably these populations became separated by vicariance after the end of the last ice age, the end of the Pleistocene. We actually know about this from evidence we have in these things called wood rat middens. But basically, evidence from these wood rat middens, where we can find fossilized remains of these plants that can be dated, suggests that something like 8,000 years ago, the woodlands of these oaks were much more widespread and they occurred at much lower elevations. But by about 3,500 years ago, as the climate continued to dry out and warm up, populations of these oaks only occur in this sort of fossil record more like at an elevation of 1,200 meters or greater. And then at the present time, we know that these types of oak species really only occur higher at elevations higher than about 1,400 meters at the present. So the range of this species has sort of contracted over time since the last ice age ended, sort of via this process of vicariance, where suitable habitat for the species has slowly started to disappear in this particular region that has become a desert. Now, this hasn't happened to the species in other parts of their range, but in the part of their range that has been very much influenced by aridity over the last 10,000 years, vicariance has driven these populations to have smaller and smaller and smaller populations. And we call these, again, disjunct populations, such as we see here on the right. Something not totally different than disjunct distributions is something called endemic distribution. And endemic species are those that have really restricted geographic ranges. That is to say, they really only occur within one geographic area and nowhere else in the world. And we can think of a couple examples of this here in California, things like the coast redwood or things like the giant sequoia. And these two conifers, which are pretty closely related to one another, uh, are endemic to the California floristic province. That's the only place in the world where they occur. And when we're talking about the California floristic province, we're talking about a certain ecological area. But basically, we're saying that coast redwoods, as we can observe, really only occur on this narrow belt along the central and northern California coasts, and a little bit into Oregon, but that's it. Coast redwoods don't occur naturally anywhere else in the world. And likewise, we could look at the distribution of giant sequoias. They only occur along this very narrow belt here in the Sierra Nevada mountains and nowhere else in the world. And this is kind of interesting. Why is this the case? Were they once more widespread? Uh, Evidence suggests that yes, they were. And similar to what we see with our oak species, probably their suitable habitat contracted over time tremendously to the point where the only places that they could occur were areas that had sufficient suitable habitat for them, for example, along the coast for coast redwood, or in these certain very specific kinds of habitats in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And these kind of endemics we call paleoendemics because they're species that probably had really widespread distribution in the ancient past, only to become endemic more recently because their ranges have contracted so much. This is a little bit different than something we call neoendemics. And neoendemic species are those that descended from an ancestor that was able to disperse into a new area. And so an example of this might be Darwin's finches, the Galapagos finches, which we know descend from a common ancestor that originally lived in Ecuador, that had a small subset of its population, colonized the Galapagos Islands, maybe multiple subsets over time, but whatever the case may be, the Galapagos Islands were colonized by an ancestral finch species, which was then later able to diversify into multiple endemic finch species that only occur on the Galapagos Island, but they did so sort of after the fact, more recently. So we would call them neoendemics. And so when we think about this from this sort of perspective of historical biogeography, we sort of think as we could think of these paleoendemics having arisen via vicariance, and these neoendemics having arisen via dispersal. Now, these different processes of, again, vicariance or dispersal are very much historical, but in the more sort of modern context, thinking about this sort of in terms of ecological biodiversity, we can see how these distributions are really influencing the structure of biotic communities. And so these long-term evolutionary outcomes seem to have outcomes that are playing out in the present time, leading us to see how different species co-occur with one another at the level of communities or even ecosystems. And this is sort of looking at this as a different biological unit. Now, this is kind of a complicated framework on the left that explains this, but basically, there might be the common ancestor of some particular lineage, which is pre-adapted to moist conditions with moderate pH soil. And maybe one lineage disperses into an area with low pH, and its descendants basically all go extinct because they can't deal with those conditions. But maybe the other lineage is able to disperse into areas where the conditions are sort of conducive to its survival according to the amount of moisture in the landscape. And maybe the pH is sort of moderate throughout this environment. And so because of this pre-adaptation, this lineage is able to diversify across this landscape, even into areas that are maybe somewhat dry. Maybe new mutations arise that allow different populations within this lineage to still survive in conditions that are relatively dry. But this idea leads to the fact that we see certain lineages of relatively closely related species that occupy really, really different places. For example, again, we can look at oaks. And these oak species have descendant lineages that can persist in a whole variety of different geographic areas that have really similar ecology. For example, Quercus agrifolia, which is the coast live oak, it's pretty common here in Southern California, occurs in areas that are very ecologically similar to the cork oak, Quercus suber, which occurs in Spain. And of course, California and Spain are very, very far apart from one another. But as it turns out, they have very, very similar climates. And so, by virtue of this sort of model we see in the cartoon, lineages of these oaks have been able to diversify sort of across the globe into areas that are very broadly separated geographically, but that are not too different climatically that their ancestors were pre-adapted to deal with. And this is an example with just one lineage or one genus. But if you could imagine this happening with a whole bunch of different lineages that are each pre-adapted to dealing with these different environmental circumstances, we get to the situation where different kinds of ecosystems can form in very, very similar environments. And these kinds of ecosystems turn out to be very similar. For example, such as the kinds of ecosystems we see occurring in the tropics, or the kinds of ecosystems we see occurring in the subtropics, or in deserts, or in more temperate regions. Because of processes of vicariance and dispersal, we see that there has been widespread diversification within these areas, and similar taxonomic groups have been able to do well in areas with similar climates, and similar ecological communities have been able to develop in areas with similar environmental conditions. And this is kind of what led Alfred Russel Wallace to understand the distribution of these different biogeographic realms, although he might not have understood all of the underlying evolutionary principles and geographic principles behind this. He certainly recognized that there was something going on. And again, this idea that different pre-adapted species, different species who are able to tolerate similar conditions, seem to have overlapping geographical ranges, and these ranges overlap in their tolerance to the environmental conditions, which basically is kind of basically saying that they occupy similar ecological niches. When this happens, we have the formation of something called community assemblages. So species are assembling together in areas that are sort of ecologically similar. And a very obvious example of this, even on a local scale, comes with looking at how the distribution of plant communities varies depending on the direction that slopes face. So this image here shows a chaparral shrubland here in California. On the one side, we see a slope that faces north, and on the other side, we see a slope that faces south. And I'm not sure how obvious this might be to you, but if you look carefully, the composition of plants on the north-facing shrubland is much different than the composition of plants on the south-facing shrubland. These plants tend to be taller, tend to be more, tend to require more moisture, and these plants tend to be shorter and tend to not require as much moisture and are more tolerant to heat and exposure to light compared to plants on the north-facing shrubland. Why might that be? Well, as it turns out, this is directly related to geographic processes. It has to do with the fact that the sun angle is not the same in all particular environments. The incident sun rays are coming down at different angles and striking these slopes at different angles. So south-facing slopes tend to be a little bit more exposed when compared to north-facing slopes. South-facing slopes here in this environment in Southern California are receiving more direct sunlight when compared to north-facing slopes, which are receiving much less direct sunlight, which is directly influencing the kinds of environments that exist on these two contrasting slopes. Because south-facing slopes are much more exposed, they don't retain moisture nearly as well as north-facing slopes, which are not as exposed. And that really creates a situation where we have these two contrasting niches. And these two contrasting niches on these two different kinds of slopes is really dictating the kinds of communities that can assemble, or the composition of species that can exist in these two environments, which are really just right next to each other, but they completely vary in terms of the ecological conditions that exist there. And this kind of process really is what leads to something we call biotic zonation. And so there are different zones where different kinds of species can do better within compared to other zones. And a classic example of this is the distribution of plant species along mountain slopes. going from low elevations to high elevations. And so we can see a situation, for example, in this hypothetical cartoon, where at very low elevations, we might have more arid adapted uh, desert type vegetation that doesn't require a lot of moisture. As we start to go higher, we start to see vegetation that's less arid adapted, that starts to require a bit more moisture. And then even higher up, we see vegetation that's really not arid adapted that much at all. It requires even more moisture. And then at the highest extent of this particular mountain slope, we see vegetation that is completely not arid adapted at all, that really needs a lot of moisture. Things like conifer forests or things like pine oak woodlands need a lot more moisture compared to these desert scrublands. And we know, based on all kinds of evidence, this is just one example in this graph here, that precipitation tends to increase with elevation. And so as we go from low elevations to high elevations, the amount of precipitation is going up. And this is evidence coming from mountain ranges in the California desert, by the way, but this plays out in all kinds of environments across the globe, where there's more and more and more precipitation going up this mountain slope. And as one goes higher up this mountain slope, the environment is able to support species that are receiving higher amounts of rainfall. And this situation often leads to the formation of these things we call sky islands. So at the very tops of certain mountains, particularly here in the southwestern United States, there are biotic communities that are really, really different from the biotic communities that surround them. And we might call these communities islands, islands of conifers or islands of pine oak woodlands that are very isolated from other such islands of conifers or pine oak woodlands, surrounded by tons and tons and tons and tons of desert vegetation. And so this is an interesting feature of biogeographical patterns that is very much influencing the distribution of species. So this process of how species tend to colonize island-like environments has actually been proposed via this framework of something called the island biogeography theory. And this basically is a framework that's attempting to predict the amount of biodiversity that should accumulate in isolated communities. And this basically postulates that species richness of a particular community, whether it's actually a true island or just an isolated area of available suitable habitat, the richness of that area is going to be correlated with the probability of dispersal and the size of the area within which individuals are dispersing into. And so, for example, we might have this sort of crazy looking set of curved looking lines here, but basically we see species richness increasing on this sort of x-axis, and we have sort of these two mirror-like dependent axes. Don't get too lost in trying to understand the complexity behind this. The idea basically is that the closer that a particular area is to a potential colonizing source species, that is to say, the mainland, the closer an island is to the mainland, and the larger that island is, the higher the probability that that island will be colonized and have high species richness. In contrast, the smaller that an island is, and the further away it is from a mainland colonizing source population, the lower the probability that there will be dispersal to it, and the lower the species richness that will occur there. And this also has something to do with rates of extinction. Probably over time, once species richness starts to go up on an island that has been colonized, there comes a point where only so many more new species can come to colonize that island, and this starts to lead to higher probabilities of extinction. Larger islands might not have as high of a probability of extinction because they have more available habitats, more available niches, but smaller islands might have a higher chance of species becoming extinct from them. Now, this framework has been debated, it's been tested. Some evidence suggests that this plays out to be true often. Other evidence suggests that it turns out to not necessarily be so accurate all the time, but there's a basic framework here to understand that, again, the closer that potential habitat is to be where individuals can disperse into, the higher the chance of species richness going up within those areas, whereas When islands are really far from the mainland, it's going to be harder for individuals from a mainland population to disperse into island population. And species richness doesn't just depend upon the probability of dispersal, but it also depends upon latitude in a lot of ways. And what we can kind of see with this example here is that the richness of native species really declines with distance from the equator as one moves towards the poles. So tropical environments tend to support a lot higher species richness when compared to environments that are closer to the poles and further from the equator. And we see here this example showing latitude on this axis here, and the richness of native plant species on the y-axis at a multitude of different locations distributed across this latitudinal range. So, for example, Brazil is pretty close to the equator, has a pretty high species richness of native plants. Likewise, Venezuela. But as we start to go further and further from the poles, say toward Mexico, southern North America, sort of toward New York, and sort of more temperate climates, and even toward the poles like Anchorage, Alaska, we see that native species richness is going down and down and down and down and down. And so certain geographical factors related to latitude are really important in dictating how much biomass or how much biodiversity could be supported in that environment. These tropical environments are warm, they're sunny year round, they're very wet. Whereas these environments closer to the poles are not so warm and they're not sunny all of the year, and they might not necessarily be getting so much rainfall all the time. And so these are just different factors dictating how many species can occur in different areas. Likewise, we can look at the fact that habitat area, or the amount of suitable habitat, really can dictate the amount of species richness that can occur in a particular spot. So, for example, if we were to go out and look at 100 meters of habitat, we might find, say, 25 species. If we were to go out and look at 250 areas of suitable habitat, we might find twice that number of species. But as we start to look at more and more and more area of suitable habitat, the number of species richness, the amount of species starts to level off. And so the relationship between habitat area and species richness is not necessarily linear. It's more curvilinear. And so there comes a point that despite the fact that we could have a large island habitat, nonetheless, there's going to come a point where that habitat can only support so many species compared to even smaller habitats. And this is because the environment's being constrained by all kinds of different geographical factors. And so when we talk about diversity, we're talking about something that does account for species richness, but also accounts for the abundances of species. So there might be X number of species there, but how many individuals comprise populations of each species? And diversity can be measured in a few different ways with this respect. For example, we might look at diversity across a landscape scale, and this is what we refer to as alpha, beta, and gamma diversity. So for example, let's say we have three different sites, A, B, and C. The diversity of species within each site would be referred to as its alpha diversity, simply to say how many species occur there. So site A has 4 species, site B has 4 species, site C has 6 species. So site C has higher alpha diversity when compared to sites A and B. But what we see is that site A has a species that site B does not have. And likewise, site B has a species that neither site A or site B has, site C has. And likewise, site C has a couple species that neither sites A or sites B have. And so we can start looking at this thing called beta diversity. That is, how much diversity occurs among these different sites when we compare them. Site A and site B only share or I should say, site A and site B differ by 2 species. Site A and site C differ by 2 species. Site B and site C differ by 4 species. So the composition of these sites is not the same. And this represents the distribution of biodiversity across the landscape. And we can sort of look at the overall distribution of biodiversity across the landscape with this thing called gamma diversity. And that is to say, amongst sites A, B, and C, even though they're separated, how many species are there? And it turns out that there are 7 species shared, or 7 different species distributed amongst these different sites. So diversity is often viewed in this way, where how much diversity occurs at the local scale. How does the composition of different sites compare when we look at diversity among them? And then how much diversity really is there overall in total amongst all of the sites across an entire landscape? Well, this is one way that ecologists and evolutionary biologists will look at the distribution of diversity. There are other measures as well, such as things like the Shannon Index or Sorensen's Index. These are just more complicated mathematical ways of evaluating diversity in a quantitative way. But basically, we're looking at how many species are there and how are the differences in the distributions of these species playing out when compared across different environments. And so as diverse communities begin to assemble, it really leads to the formation of these things we call ecosystems. And ecosystems are composed of all kinds of different communities, communities of plants, communities of animals, communities of fungi, perhaps, communities of even microbes, maybe in the soil. And all of these different communities are really interacting in some interesting ways that are directly related to the availability of energy. And these kinds of interactions are called trophic interactions. And that is what is illustrated on this cartoon here. Basically, we're seeing something we would call a primary producer who is supplying all of the energy to this particular ecosystem. So in this case, it's a grass. Typically in ecosystems, this is happening via photosynthesis. So different photosynthetic organisms like plants or maybe even algae are able to take energy from the sun and turn it into sugar that other organisms can use. And the availability of that energy starts to work its way upstream through these trophic relationships. And what we might see here is that in this example, the grass produces 1,000 kilojoules of energy that are available to a primary consumer, such as this grasshopper. So the grasshopper is consuming the grass. And then we also have things like this bluebird that can consume this grasshopper, which is like a secondary consumer. And then things like the snake that can consume this bluebird, which is like a tertiary consumer. And things like this owl, which can consume this snake, which is sort of like an apex predator, so called because probably nothing else is really going to be preying upon this owl. And so we see that the energy from this grass is flowing upstream into each of these different consumers. And ultimately, as these organisms finally pass on, their bodies break down in the soil, they're really being decomposed by things like fungi. And fungi is really efficient at taking some of the nutrients that are available within these decomposing bodies and allowing them to become recycled back into the ecosystem. And so this whole process is really very functional. However, as it turns out, this process is very energy inefficient. And so if we look at the amount of energy produced by this grass and the amount of energy consumed by each of these upstream consumers, we can start to see pretty quickly that about 90% of the energy consumed by each upstream trophic level is being lost. How is this playing out? Well, if this grass produces 1,000 kilojoules of energy, and this grasshopper is able to consume this grass, even though it might take in 1,000 kilojoules of energy from the grass, it's actually only able to use 100 of those kilojoules in order to undergo its normal physiological function. The other 900 kilojoules of energy are simply lost to the environment, either as ambient heat or as energy that simply can't be used. This is interesting. So 90% of the energy that this grasshopper consumed from the grass is being lost. Likewise, when this bluebird consumes this grasshopper, the bluebird's only going to be able to get 10% of the energy from the grasshopper. So if the bluebird consumed 100 kilojoules from this grasshopper, which the grasshopper got from the grass, the bluebird's only going to be able to use 10 kilojoules of that energy. Again, 10% of the energy that it got from the grasshopper. Likewise, if this snake consumes this bluebird, This snake might get 10 kilojoules of energy from the bluebird, but it's only going to be able to use one of those kilojoules. So 90% of the energy is being lost yet again. And then by the time we get to the owl who consumes the snake, the owl is only able to get, again, 10% of the energy that it gets from the snake. So if it takes 1 kilojoule from the snake, it's only using a tenth of a kilojoule of that energy. And so we see the situation that by the time the owl is able to get the energy that came from this grass, most of that energy has been lost along the way. This is just kind of an interesting property of ecosystems, but it is a fact that they tend to be energy inefficient. And this has interesting consequences in terms of the laws of thermodynamics. But basically, as all this energy is being lost, it can never really be used again. And that's kind of just, again, an interesting consequence of the assembly of different communities, the formation of different ecosystems, and the way that energy is flowing through them. Energy is a finite resource. It is in limited supply. And this kind of provides somewhat of an explanation for why most of the biomass in ecosystems tends to accumulate at lower trophic levels. Most of the biomass in an ecosystem is probably going to be in the producers or lower level consumers, whereas at these higher levels, we don't see nearly as much biomass, probably because there's simply just not as much energy available. And so we would expect to find higher abundance of individual producers, a slightly lower abundance of primary consumers, and even lower and lower abundances of these higher level consumers. And it's actually not surprising if you go out into nature and start to make observations. This is what you're going to see. You'll probably find lots of plants. You might find lots of grasshoppers. You might not find nearly as many bluebirds or birds in general. You might find even fewer tertiary consumers, and good luck finding an owl. And so this is just an interesting, again, property of ecosystems that explains how the distribution of biodiversity and the distribution of biomass are playing out simply because of the laws of thermodynamics. So I'd like to shift gears here a little bit and talk about how our understanding of biogeography really relates to climate change. And as it turns out, there are certain ways that we can look at how changes in climate from the past relate to the distribution of different species and the distribution of different biotic communities. Now, one of the ways scientists have done this is by studying these wood rat middens, particularly here in North America, in arid environments. And if you don't know what a wood rat is, it's a small rodent. Here's a picture of one. This is the dusky-footed wood rat. And these wood rats have an interesting behavior. They will basically go out into the environment around their den where they live, and they will collect all kinds of detritus, all kinds of different material, mostly plant material, things like stems or twigs, leaves, or fruits and seeds, or even pollen grains. Sometimes they'll also collect smaller dead animals like insects and stuff. But what they'll do is they'll pile up all of this material at their den, and they might use it for shelter or other reasons, but this is what they do. And then ultimately, these wood rats reach a point where they recognize that some of this material is no longer useful to them, so they will discard it in a sort of refuse pile. And then also at this refuse pile, they will deposit, or they will defecate and urinate. They will deposit their own waste. And this is kind of an interesting feature of this relationship they have with this material. As it turns out, as they urinate upon this material, the urine will fossilize it over long periods of time, and it'll turn into this stuff we call guano. And so this is a chunk of this type of material that has been extensively urinated upon by wood rats and has fossilized over very, very long periods of time. As it turns out, actually, this guano can last for tens of thousands of years. That's kind of interesting. Scientists have figured out how to go and break down this guano and look at the different kinds of material in it and figure out what that material is and how long it's been since that material was deposited, giving an indication of what this ecosystem might have been like at certain points in time, if that material can be dated, for example, over tens of thousands of years. Now, this type of Analysis is usually shown in something we call a wood rat midden series. And so this is a midden series here on the right, hypothetically speaking. Basically, what the midden series shows is the abundance of different fossils of two different taxa. And so these lines here are sort of representing how many individuals of a particular taxon were recovered from this midden and at what point in time. So the y-axis is showing the age of the fossil material here in basically thousands of years. So the present shown here and 45,000 years ago shown here. So this is quite a long period of time. And we can see that taxa A was pretty abundant between 10,000 and about 16, 17,000 years ago in this midden series. But it's absent in the more recent past. Whereas taxa B is present in recent times and present in the recent past and also present about 10 or 15,000 years ago. And both of these taxa appear in this midden series 45,000 years ago. And generally, we see that they're not that abundant in times in between. But basically, the point is we can see that this species occurred in this area long ago, 10, 15,000 years ago, but no longer does. Whereas this other species was way more abundant back then, but it still is managing to hang on. What does this information tell us? Well, it could be used as a proxy for understanding how the climate has changed over these really long periods of time and how that change in climate has directly influenced the distribution of species and the assembly of communities and perhaps the entire formation of ecosystems. This information is very interesting and very useful for understanding patterns of biogeographic change. If you're wondering how scientists might figure out how old this material is, by the way, they use radiocarbon dating. So the concentration of radioactive carbon in this material is used to estimate its age based on the known half-life of that isotope. Another sort of similar kind of method that's used to figure out maybe how climate has changed over relatively long periods of time is something called dendrochronology. And dendrochronology is the study of tree rings. And so basically, we can look at tree rings and compare their widths. And obviously, we can use the numbers of tree rings that a particular trunk has in order to figure out how old it is or was when it died. And we can also use the width of those rings in this tree trunk to figure out how much rainfall there was at a particular point in time, and perhaps to figure out or get an idea of what the temperature might have been during a particular season. Now, if we want to understand long-term periods of climate change using this method, it probably would make sense to look at tree species that live for a really long time. And in fact, this is what scientists very cleverly have figured out to do. And so basically, some of the longest lived tree species in the world occur in high elevation alpine environments, high up in the mountains. And as it turns out, the oldest living tree species in the world actually occurs in California, and that's the bristlecone pine. And these trees, if you've never heard of them, are pretty interesting. They live in really nutrient-poor soils. They live right up to the tree line, just about as high as trees can possibly grow in California, 11,000 feet in elevation or 3,600 meters if you prefer the metric system. And these trees can live to be on the order of about 5,000 years old. That's quite fascinating. And if you look at this picture of one of these trees, you can quickly see that they appear to be almost more dead than alive. And in fact, they kind of are. Most of the material that makes up this tree is dead tissue, and there's really only a smaller proportion of living tissue. But nonetheless, these trees survive in this environment, which also happens to be a fairly arid environment. But if we could take a look at the series of different rings that occur in the trunk of this tree, we might get not only an idea of how old the tree is, but how climate has changed, say, over 5,000 years. And that's exactly what dendrochronologists have done. And so the way this kind of plays out is that these trees, actually many plants will do this, but particularly these trees will produce their annual rings. And these annual rings are composed of two different kinds of growth tissues, or two different kinds of wood, if you will, early wood and late wood. And as the name sort of suggests, early in the season is when these plants will put down their early wood, so during, say, the spring and the summer. And then toward the end of the growing season, late summer, maybe very early fall, they'll put down this stuff called late wood. And each individual tree ring is composed of both early wood and late wood. Now, early wood is not nearly as informative as late wood. And as it turns out, the width of the late wood tissue in a tree ring is very much proportional to the amount of rainfall or the amount of water that the plant was able to take up, which is correlated with the amount of rainfall, and with the amount of temperature. So wide late woods tend to be correlated with increased growth, increased amount of precipitation, and probably warmer conditions, whereas thin sections of late wood are associated with decreased amounts of rainfall and perhaps maybe even cooler conditions. Temperature is a little harder to tease out of this, but definitely the width of this late wood is very tightly correlated with the amount of precipitation. And we can start to make inferences about how precipitation might be correlated with temperature. Whatever the case may be, we can look at a whole bunch of these different patterns in the late wood widths in a living tree sample. And we might be able to look at this over the course of thousands of years. So this is a cross section taken out of the core of one of these tree trunks. This is only showing a few seasons, but imagine looking at this over the course of thousands of seasons, and that's what dendrochronologists do. But basically, we can see variation in the widths of the late woods. We see patterns, we see periods of time where there's sort of wide late wood and sort of thin late wood. And these are different years. These different patterns represent different years of different amounts of precipitation. Now, this might not be as informative over the course of 50 or 100 years as it is looking at this over the course of 1,000 or 5,000 years. And in fact, if we can successfully look at a cross section over 5,000 years, we can have a record of how climate has changed in that period of time. And that is exactly what scientists have done in their studies of the bristlecone pine. So that's pretty interesting. However, it gets even more interesting when we start to compare the living tree sample to dead tree samples, because these dead tree samples potentially carry climate records going back even further. And as it turns out, the climate record in these different widths of late wood can be cross-dated between living trees and dead trees, and even among dead trees as well. And so we might take our living tree sample, and we can see the patterns in different widths of late wood, and we can figure out how to cross-date, how to line these things up, and that can allow us to take this climate record back even further, say in sample B, which lived longer ago than did the living tree sample. Likewise, we can take sample B and figure out where its different patterns of widths of late wood line up with that of sample A, which lived even longer ago. And now we're taking our climate record back even further. Likewise, we can take sample A and start to line up different patterns in these widths of late wood with sample C and take the climate record back even farther. So if in theory we had a living tree sample that was something like 5,000 years old, we might be able to cross-date it with sample B that lived longer ago and take our climate record back, say, 8,000 years, cross-date that sample with sample A, and that might be able to take our climate record back 10 or 12,000 years, cross-date that with sample C, and now maybe we're able to take our climate record back 15 or 20,000 years. So this is a really, really useful tool for understanding how climate has changed empirically. Now, we use weather stations nowadays to measure climate, and we've been doing that for a while, but those records only go back so far, maybe 100 years at best. This is a much better record that's been preserved in these really, really long tree species that can give us an indication of how climate has changed in the past. And this could be directly related to our understanding of how the distribution of communities and perhaps ecosystems has also changed. So these are just a couple methods we can use to try to assess how climate has changed in the past using really direct empirical evidence. But what about understanding climate change in the future? And as it turns out, there are some interesting projections that have been made by atmospheric scientists based on our knowledge of how the Earth's atmosphere changes regularly, so to speak, over kind of long periods of time, but also as it turns out, despite the fact that climate change is sort of this uh, natural aspect of the Earth's atmosphere, we are exacerbating climate change massively via our carbon emissions. This is probably not a story that's new to you. And so uh, scientists have tried to take this information and figure out how are our future projected carbon emissions expected to influence climate change. And that's really something that's directly related to the concentration of carbon dioxide in the environment. So that's sort of what's depicted here in this graph on the bottom right, where we see sort of present time here on this x-axis going into future decades on the as we go to the right, and the concentration of carbon dioxide on the y-axis going from relatively low, or what it is now anyway, to relatively higher values. And atmospheric scientists have basically developed these different models. And these models are called representative concentration pathways. These are basically estimates of what the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere might be based on projected amounts of carbon emissions in the future. And there are a few different scenarios that they have presented, such as RCP 2.6, RCP 4.5, RCP 6.0, and RCP 8.5. And what you might notice from looking at this graph at face value is that as we go to higher and higher RCP values, the situation appears to be worse and worse. And so basically, RCP 2.6 is a situation where if we really stop using all of our fossil fuels today, stop putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere would have the chance to sort of rebound and recover over the next several decades, and the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would maybe start to go down a little bit. Now, this is a very hopeful scenario. The more sort of realistic scenario, or a less hopeful scenario, is RCP 4.5, where if we stop using carbon, if we stop burning fossil fuels today, or at least seriously declined the amount by which we use them, that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would go up somewhat in the next few decades, but not by a whole lot. Our RCP6 is a little bit more of a dire situation where we're not really going to stop using carbon. We're not really going to stop using fossil fuels. Our carbon emissions are sort of going to continue. They might decrease a little, but they're going to continue. And the concentration of carbon dioxide in the environment would then go up quite a bit more, maybe almost more than twice as much. And then RCP 8.5 is really the doomsday scenario, where if we just completely ignore the problem, if we just keep on burning fossil fuels, sending more carbon dioxide into the environment, the concentration of carbon dioxide by, let's say, the year 2100 will go from about 400, where it is now, 400 parts per million, to more than 1,200 parts per million. That's a threefold increase. And this could have serious consequences for our planet in a whole multitude of ways. Consequences for all kinds of different species, including our own. The direct effect of increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere is an increase in global temperatures. And so these two maps here up on the left are kind of comparing what we think the projected temperature change on the planet's going to be under these different representative concentration pathway scenarios. So, for example, if we think about the RCP 2.6 scenario, which is, again, our sort of hopeful scenario, and we look at how temperature change is projected to happen in the next, say, 100 years, it's not going to change by very much. Maybe somewhat at more extreme parts of the globe, maybe around the poles, but by and large, there's not a lot of temperature change is not expected. In contrast, if we look at the RCP 8.5 scenario, this sort of doomsday scenario where we don't even care about burning fossil fuels, we're just going to keep doing it. We're going to allow the concentration of carbon dioxide in the environment to go through the roof, then the expected temperature change across the globe is going to be quite extreme. And we can see a marked difference between how projected temperature change is expected to play out in these two different scenarios. And so the fate of our planet, the fate of global ecosystems really is sort of on the line right now. A lot of it is based on the use of fossil fuels. There are a whole lots of other contributors to changes in climate as well, or changes in environmental degradation, I should say, things like deforestation, for example. But people need to think about this stuff. This is important. And this is directly going to be related to the change in the distribution of species, the distribution of communities, the distribution of ecosystems. And as it turns out, we depend upon many of these ecosystems for survival the survival of our own species. Marine ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems, all will depend upon how this situation plays out in the future. So scientists have also used these computer stimulated models, these species distribution models, to predict how species distributions might change under some of these different representative concentration pathway scenarios. So for example, we can look at montane plant species, those that occur in these sort of sky islands that are distributed in areas where they're sort of at the top of the mountain, and that's where their suitable habitat is. And it's probably not surprising that such species don't really have anywhere else to go as temperatures warm and as higher elevations do become warmer and drier. And so one example of this we can look at comes from the ashy silk tassel, which is a shrub that occurs here in California. And we have two different species distribution models showing where suitable habitat for this species occurs. And so again, we have suitable habitat going from 0 to 1 on this scale, 0 being these very lightish colors, 1 being these dark green colors. Same is true on this other map. And this map on the left shows what habitat suitability for the ashy silk tassel looks like at present. And so we can see the different montane environments where ashy silk tassel has suitable habitat, at least during 2022, which is probably not much different than it is now. And it seems to be doing okay. And there are areas of suitable habitat beyond the range where it occurs, where it could potentially disperse into. But if we look at what the predicted habitat suitability for this species is by the year 2070, it's about 50 years from now, under the RCP 4.5 emission scenario, which we know is a relatively moderate climate change scenario. Even under this moderate climate change scenario, we see that this species is projected to lose significant amounts of suitable habitat. And this is kind of a scary reality. Another artifact of this that we see is that these kinds of montane species are projected to have more suitable habitat at higher latitudes. So we can see that most of the suitable habitat for this species at present is at sort of these lower latitudes in this example anyway, but in the future, under this climate change scenario, its suitable habitat is projected to occur at higher latitudes and also probably at higher elevations, because at higher latitudes and higher elevations in the future, probably we think conditions are going to be cooler and perhaps wetter. So in essence, the idea is that the distribution of suitable habitat for many montane species, not just the ashy silk tassel, but all kinds of montane species, conifers, pine trees, for example. Basically, a lot of these species are going to be forced to shift their ranges up in elevation or upwards in latitude, if they can, realistically. And that's going to be an interesting situation that ecologists will be watching, I'm sure, in the many next decades, to see how this whole situation plays out. So anyway, in a nutshell, our best understanding of what climate change is going to do in the future can sort of be estimated by our understanding of how the Earth's atmosphere reacts to changes in concentrations of carbon dioxide, changes in global temperature, and we can use that information to simulate how this might affect the distribution of species in the future. And the answer seems to look like, or the situation seems to look like, there will be changes in the future. And if anybody thinks our species is not going to be affected by changes, they are probably very poorly informed. And so these are important ideas for people to be focused on, for people to be thinking about, because this very much will affect many, many future generations of our own species and many, many other species. So anyway, that's kind of the whole take-home message of this, and that's kind of the whole idea behind not only how we think about biogeography, Obviously, there's a lot of information there, but how can we use our knowledge of biogeography to think about the future of our planet? Okay, that's it for this lecture. I'll catch up with you next time.